Panel discussion today talking about smartphone otoendoscopy, looking at current trends and future directions. Our panel today, Asitha Jayawardena, who is Chief Resident at Vanderbilt, Elliot Kozin, Fellow here at Mass Eye and Ear, Lauren Miller, Resident here at Mass Eye and Ear, and I'm Jason Brandt at University of Pennsylvania. Only disclosure is that I have ownership and IP in a company that makes a smartphone adapter for endoscopes. So I will do my best to avoid any mentions of that. So first question is why smartphones? And the simplest answer is availability. So a couple years old stats in the United States is that over 80% of physicians use smartphones. That was a 2018 survey, or it was published in 2018. It was from the years before, so most likely that number is higher now. Additionally, a recent industry survey found that over 90% of hospitals and hospital systems are actively investing in mobile technology for their providers. There are lots of software solutions from EMRs and third parties that are helping to bring imaging and videos directly into patient charts and patient care. And then as we look around the world, there's significant variability. The study shown on the right broke it up into advanced economies and emerging economies. Even in emerging economies, the median smartphone usage for the average population was just under half, so still at 45%. And you could imagine that the areas within the hospitals, healthcare providers are probably a little bit higher than that. And then the technology of the smartphones. So modern smartphones routinely include HD cameras that are 1080 or better. A lot of them have 4K for video, even with high frame rates at this point. There's secure storage, so many of the hospital-provided mobile hardware has mobile device management, so they can lock down your phone, they can erase it if it gets lost, they can control how you share it, which images can go to which applications. And then they're all connected, so they have secure email, HIPAA-compliant apps, and as I mentioned before, apps from the EMRs, proprietary, so you can bring video and pictures directly into a patient chart and not have to worry about where that information is going outside of that. And then in addition to that, generally have standard high-speed Wi-Fi, and then other connection options such as Bluetooth and proprietary third parties that you can stream directly to monitors for teaching or for patient education. Additionally, the average turnover in the US for smartphones is just under 2 years. It's about 22 months. So every 22 months, you're getting brand new hardware, which for legacy systems in hospitals, getting updates like that would be nearly impossible. And then looking at the privacy issues, so on the medical record and the HIPAA issues, again, many of the EMRs have mobile apps, so you don't have to worry about where that picture is going. It never goes in the picture roll. It doesn't get texted anywhere. It just goes directly to their chart, and it happens immediately. So you can have a patient in the chair, take a picture. By the time you go do your note, it's already in their chart. And then for US law under HIPAA, images that don't include externally identifiable features are not considered PHI. So if you're taking pictures of the ear, you're taking pictures of the inside of the nose, things like that, as long as there's no shots of the face or any unique identifying features, then technically that image on its own is not PHI and doesn't need to be on a HIPAA-protected server. As soon as you add patient information, if you try to email it or text it or something, obviously that changes. And then Dr. Kozin is going to discuss the current options for the portable otoendoscopy equipment.
So just a brief overview of what I'm going to discuss over the next few minutes. First, what is the otoscope SmartBird hybrid, the endoscope smartphone hybrid, the smartphone alone, and then some other non-smartphone options. So I think it's important to understand some of the nomenclature. This gets sort of confusing when you look to see what's available. So we all know this to be an otoscope, and we all know this to be an endoscope, but it also can be considered an otoendoscope as well. So when you combine a otoscope with a smartphone, you end up getting a otoscope smartphone hybrid. So basically what you're doing, and I'll just move over here, you're essentially just taking the attachment that you normally would see on this regular otoscope and then attaching it to the ocular piece or the phone piece on the smartphone itself. So it generally takes the same picture that you might see with the regular otoscope. So then sort of conversely, when you have an endoscope and then you combine it to a smartphone, you end up with an endoscope smartphone hybrid. And these come in a lot of different varieties. I'll just come over here and point because I don't think I have a laser pointer. So the main thing to think about with these is this attachment here. So sometimes the endoscope will connect directly to the camera itself, and then other times you can buy this extra piece which provides some additional optics, sort of a wide field view, magnification, and it augments what already exists in the smartphone itself. So if you don't have that piece on the bottom they can be relatively inexpensive. I have no disclosures whatsoever. They can range anywhere from like $50 to $150. Some people can 3D print them. So they're just essentially an attachment to connect the endoscope to the phone. The main thing about that, if you do this attachment, is you still need the light source. So in this case, you can see the light source is sort of dangling down. So you really need these two additional pieces. There have been studies that have been done elsewhere that shows maybe you don't even need any attachments. If you have an assistant who sort of holds the ear open straight into the canal, maybe you can use the optics of the smartphone itself to take a picture. And here you can see some examples. When you look to see what's available, I think more and more you might hear about these. And so these are these light pens or otoscopes that are available on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon, you type in ear and otoscope or ear and endoscope, you'll see these devices that cost, about $150. And they're really targeted to parents and care providers. Almost all the pictures show these little kids that are sleeping and the parents sort of sneaking in to take a picture. Bad idea. So we think Q-tips are dangerous. I think that this is a little bit unbelievable that this type of advertising exists, but it's a huge hand with a small baby. So we might hear more about this. So then there are other things where you can have actually the screen itself on the otoscope. They're available. And then what you might purchase from a medical provider, all the branding has been taken off of this, is sort of a kit. So you have the light source, you have the monitor, and then you could plug in an endoscope as well. And some people might be able to use this, say, if they need it portably, if they go abroad, if they're doing mission trips, animal work sometimes, this is a nice option. The optics are not as good as the standard operating room, HD TV and 3-chip camera, but it's sort of one step above. So in summary, there's really a range of smartphone and non-smartphone options, and I think we should all be aware of this consumer-grade otoscopy that we might hear about from our patients in the clinic in the next few years. Thank you.
So next we're going to go through a few different kind of situations that have different benefits and advantages for using smartphone endoscopy. So first I'm going to discuss uses in the clinic. So the main advantage of having photo and video documentation is improved documentation. So up till now, you just write down what you see, and 3 months later, you see them back, and you say, yeah, that looks about 30%, or yeah, that looks a little drier and a little bit worse. But having an image there just makes it much easier. You can compare progression over time, and then it also makes it much easier to look back for surgical outcomes. You look back and did your japanoplasty. What did it look like 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years out? And looking back at comparing your own techniques. It's also very helpful for education of patients and families. I mean, I talk to my head and neck colleagues and try to explain what I see in the ear, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And so much less the patients or the families, and you're talking about what the cholesteatoma is, what the ossicles are, where things are, how bad it looks before, when you did your repair, but they don't hear any better, and they say, well, what did you do? It's all the same. You can really just show them and say, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like now, this is what the plan is going forward. It also opens up a lot of opportunities for machine learning and artificial intelligence. One of the panels upstairs just had a paper doing deep learning on otoendoscopic images of TMs and automated diagnosis and triage of people and saying, okay, you need to go this way or you need to go that way, or this looks like a healthy eardrum, you don't worry about it. And all of those things add up to basically more efficient use of specialists and subspecialists. So especially in healthcare systems that are centralized or managed, such as government healthcare run systems or managed care, if you can spare the time of your specialist and your subspecialists, then that reduces the overall healthcare cost and burden. If the patient doesn't have to drive 50 miles to see the next person, if you could just send the video over, send the picture over and say, this is what I saw, did they need to come down, did they need surgery, what else do they need? It saves time for the patient and it saves resources for the system as a whole. And then you can do all of those things with the existing hardware. So the main comparison to traditional video tower equipment is cost. And the towers can be tens of thousands of dollars, where a smartphone setup can be a few $100s with the 3D printed version and some of the lower end phones that still have good cameras and good connectivity. This is more of a little bit of a personal bias, but even the high-end towers that we have that say they connect everything, it's still very difficult to get the images off and get them where you need it. You can't just put them in email, put them in a secure text, send them over to a colleague, send them to who you need to be, or for teaching purposes, send them to residents and do things like conferences and grand rounds and get back to that easily. And then the last is portability. So if you're in a situation where you can't have a tower in every room, do you need to wait and swap out your patient to bring them to the tower room, or can you grab your phone and go to each room that you need, get the documentation that you want, get the pictures, and then move on? So the next kind of use case we're going to talk about is in training and education, and Dr. Miller is going to do that.
Yeah, so another common use that we can find these helpful is in an academic medical center and especially in residency training. At our program, we have increasingly been using smartphones with the adapter attached to it, both in consults as well as in our ENT-focused emergency department to help see consults and new patients more efficiently. Admittedly, currently we're still using it mostly with the flexible laryngoscopies and with rigid endoscopes, mostly for the sinuses, but we have been using otoendoscopes to some degree, currently especially in our emergency department. From our standpoint, using it can be extremely helpful in terms of saving time. I think the ease of burden is probably the most helpful thing. As Jason was alluding to, video towers are extremely painful to lug around, to bring up, to transmit and record the images off of, and then get to an attending. So being able to do all of that on a smartphone can be extremely easy and save a lot of time and actually ease the burden immensely for us in terms of seeing consults. Additionally, as an education tool, it's very valuable. So being able to, send it to a senior resident or an attending, and then in real time have them evaluate both the anatomical details, our impression of the imaging, and then also even the technique, which can sometimes be quite obvious. Some of the mistakes that might have been made on the video itself can be very helpful to see that in real time and be able to, kind of track the progress over time. And then, I think finally another obvious benefit for us is being able to send over this video can eliminate repeat scopes, repeat examinations, which can both save time and then also be more helpful, more beneficial for patients. Having repeat procedures done on inpatient floors can take time, can take extra effort, patients can get frustrated, and it can also delay treatment time. As I mentioned in our ER, we have a lot of different ENT-focused diagnoses that come in, and many times our emergency department does not have attending coverage either at night or over the weekend. So being able to have some sort of mechanism in place that we can actually send it and allow for faster decision-making, triage time, and then management to get them out of the ER, get them to the spot that they need to be can be extremely helpful. And then finally, being able to use this technique just in terms of using it in endoscopic surgery or using it with an attending in place, continuing to have that iterative procedural skill can be extremely helpful, and doing it with the an attachment just allows us to be able to do it more. I will say two kind of challenges we've run into with this is, one, sometimes it can be challenging, especially with the adapter in place, to fit onto all the phones. Kind of, again, as Jason alluded to, one of the benefits of using mobile phones is their turnaround time is so fast and the technology keeps going, but that also means the adapter and where the actual camera is changes a lot too. So we have to actually change where the adapter is, which can sometimes be hard to find the right phone for the right adapter. And then the second thing is sometimes just the variability. There have been some studies that have looked at, live examinations compared to remote examinations, and if there is actually, concordance between those evaluations, most of which have been pretty good. But there is still always that concern that they might just want to do that repeat live examination to kind of feel see the patient in person, kind of get a better sense of what's going on beyond just that imaging or that video at that time. And then I'll leave it to
And then the last case that we're going to discuss is use abroad, use when traveling. So Dr. Jawardina.
Thanks. So I'm Asid. I'm one of the chief residents at Vanderbilt and the upcoming PEDS fellow here at Mass Eye and Ear. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple global trends that I think are positioning smartphones and smartphone otoendoscopy to be a game changer when it comes to hearing healthcare in the developing world. So first of all, the prevalence of hearing loss is vast and is only increasing. By 2050, 900 million people will have disabling hearing loss, and 80% of those will be found in low and middle income countries. But in addition to this trend of increasing hearing loss, there's also a trend, as Jason mentioned earlier, that cell phone ownership is actually caught up to the United States when it comes to mobile access to care. So this is a picture of a Maasai warrior in Kenya using his cell phone while he's herding his cattle. I put this up there to represent that Kenya's mobile penetration is up to 88% as of 2017. And it's not just cell phone technology, it's also internet access. So over the course of the past 2 decades, there's been a series of undersea cables that have been laid along the coast of Africa, the continent of Africa, that has corresponded with an increased internet growth over the past 20 years in over 941%. So with this in mind, knowing that places like Kenya, for example, have only 1.5 otolaryngologists per every 1 million people, we know that there's a high incidence of disease in these regions, very poor access to healthcare, but smartphone technology and internet access certainly is available. Some of these countries have gone to utilizing community health workers to offload the burden off of tertiary care providers to go out into the community and get access to various health data points. So we kind of incorporated that into our hearing screening protocol. So we train community health workers how to use smartphones to gather both audiometric and otologic data. So the community health worker goes out into the community. We conducted school-wide hearing screening studies and had them conduct an initial audiometric evaluation that took about 90 seconds. We played 3 different frequencies at 35 decibels. If the children were able to hear that, they passed and moved on. If they failed, they then underwent a more comprehensive screen, which was an air conduction audiogram that took place on the cell phone. And if they maintained a 35 decibel hearing loss at that point, they then underwent otoscopy. And we used an otoscopic attachment to a cell phone, which I'll review in a second. All of that data, so the otoscopic image and the audiometric data, then was stored locally in the cell phone until that cell phone gained access to Wi-Fi, at which point it was uploaded via the cloud to a HIPAA-compliant network where the providers could then review it. We trialed a number of different software, and ultimately we're currently using the HearX Group's HearScope is the name of their scope. We use that not necessarily because it gets better otoscopic images, but because it has the ability to combine an audiometric evaluation into their platform. And then this is just an example of a web-based way for a provider to review all the information that we were gathering. So basically what we wanted to do is kind of what's represented here. For a community health worker to go out into the community, gather audiometric and otoscopic data, and then allow a provider remotely to then basically triage patients that need to make the 6-7 hour journey into the city to see a tertiary care provider, or if they can say, okay, this child has normal hearing or a mild hearing loss, they just need preferential seating, or maybe they just need to see an audiologist and get fitted with hearing aids. So I think that smartphone technology certainly is not only capable of success in the developing world, but I think it's set up to thrive in that setting.
So every situation is a little bit different, and especially how things get reimbursed. And so from the U.S. perspective, just this year, telehealth and remote visits are starting to get reimbursed by CMS. So I think we're just at the very beginning of where these kind of techniques and these options can go. But even within that, looking around at our colleagues in other specialties and where they've gone with it, dermatology is really way ahead of all the other specialties. So there are commercially available apps. You can take a picture of your mole. It'll give you a risk score. There's dermatology telehealth services. So you can send in pictures. Primary cares can send them to dermatologists as consults. You don't have to wait. You don't have to physically be there for them to look at it and say, keep track of it or come in and get a biopsy. There is a company for gynecology that uses some hardware with a smartphone-based colposcopy, and they built a HIPAA-compliant backend. So they're using it for documentation for assault, so for time-critical things like that you can't necessarily wait for someone if you're in a rural setting, or if you're in somewhere where you don't have an expert to perform those exams. You may lose evidence if that doesn't get captured. And then again, sharing images with experts. Dr. Miller alluded to it a little bit also, but laryngoscopy, so in our center at our children's hospital, every patient that gets scoped gets videoed. And the reason was because the resident would go see him and scope it, then the fellow would come see it and scope the kid again, and then the attending would come down, and that could be hours later. And so to avoid multiple scopes on infants and small children, they get videoed the first time, it gets sent to the fellow and the attending, they can look at it in real time and say, okay, this is a problem, this isn't a problem, we'll go deal with it later. And then for the most part, our adult patients who get scoped do also. I can say, as turning the corner from resident to attending, it's nice to be able to get a picture that I can look at instead of trusting the second year at 2 in the morning from the emergency room. And so I did want to leave a little time, because I'm mostly curious as to what people are doing. There is some literature that kind of validates cell phones, but there's not a whole lot of kind of use cases and cost-benefit analysis and things like that that have been published in this area specifically yet. So kind of to see people's experiences with the camera abilities. Are they getting good enough pictures that you think you would operate using an image, or is it more just for diagnosis and then you switch over to the better operative cameras to actually do procedures? Availability, privacy issues, people doing remote work, teaching settings, anything like that. So I could open it up to either the panel or anybody in the audience with any questions or comments. Yeah.
Can a smartphone can be used for audiological small procedure like removal of the wax and mandibulotomy?
Okay.
Can it be used?
Yeah, I mean, as a resident, just a personal anecdote from it, our clinics moved away from our inpatient hospital, so we no longer had a microscope, so we could do tubes on the floor. And so I used the one that we have at our hospital and did tubes on ICU patients, basically to avoid them getting rolled across the street with their ventilators and the nursing time and everything that takes like that. So the ergonomics of it aren't bad. I mean, you're looking at a pretty good sized screen. It's a little bit more clunky than kind of the operating room setup, but it doesn't take too long to get used to it.
I don't want to talk about cerumen, because I know that's everyone's favorite topic in the room, but actually when you can remove cerumen with an endoscope much more easily than you can with one of these otoscopes that you're trying to sort of go through this very small opening. Because you're using the actual ear canal itself, the entire portal, just placement of the endoscope itself doesn't take up that much room. So actually for consults, when I was a resident and I got a consult for wax, I would much more readily use the endoscope and some suction than try to use one of these, otoscopes that has a little sliding window and you could put a loop through it.
What is your light source?
Still use the portable light source for the endoscope. So one of the products that's more of the otoscope hybrid that Ellie described uses the light from the camera. Most of the other ones haven't really figured out how to do that yet, so you still use a separate light source.
So I, about 2 years ago, completed a pilot using the CellScope product. We did a 1-year pilot in primary care. I worked at Kaiser Permanente Northwest in Portland, Oregon. It was highly adopted. It was very successful. But our 2 biggest barriers and the reasons we stopped the pilot was that the company couldn't keep up with the adaptations of the smartphones and where the camera gets moved. And Apple we use Apple products. They move that iPhone camera by a millimeter every time they make a new phone. And this was a small company. It's still a small company. And they couldn't keep up in terms of printing the adapter. The actual device and the photographic quality was excellent, and we could make diagnoses remotely very easily with primary care and give them immediate feedback to really kind of extend our specialty reach. The second problem was we couldn't get it integrated into our EHR. We use Epic. And if you take the picture directly in Haiku, which is Epic's mobile platform for the phone, Haiku turns the light off. So if you're going to try, you guys are nodding, some of you have tried to do this. If you've ever tried to take a picture in Haiku, just bypassing the CellScope app itself, you can only do it with the flash, which I can do, but a primary care doctor is not going to be able to do because it's just challenging to get a full view. So these were the challenges we came up against, and again, because the company's small, they didn't have the funding to integrate with Epic through the App Orchard. So I'm just wondering what other experiences you guys have had. I've really searched for other products because in terms of the interest in it, our primary care folks were incredibly receptive, and it was a very successful pilot. But in terms of the technology issues, they were insurmountable.
Yeah, I'd say we had the same problem with the cell scope. I mean, they and Apple and these cell phone companies will never change moving the location of the camera because it allows them to sell more cases. It's kind of like part of their strategy, I think. So some people have been using 3D printing to basically kind of create exactly what the cell scope has done, where it just kind of moves that little piece. And so that's an easy way, if you have access to 3D printing, to kind of get by that. I don't think that there's anybody commercially that's kind of selling those little 3D printing things. I think it'd be kind of up to each individual institution to get there that way. So.
Yes, they are. No. So there's a company in the UK called Endoscope Eye. So they sell a unit that clips onto the phone. So one's a C-mount, and the C-mount separately screws onto the adapter that clips onto an iPhone. So they will separately sell the adapter that clips on. So as you upgrade your phone, you upgrade your adapter for about 50, 60 bucks. Yeah. And you can then still use your iPhone.
So we have no connection. I've actually used, I think your, or not your product, but that product is very good just because of, just because of that, the expense is relatively low, and you can literally see this library of different options that are available. And there's no special optics. That one clip that I showed you was actually from that company, and it works reasonably well. So there are less expensive options, but I totally agree with you. I think I bought 3 different clip prostheses by the time I was like, this is enough, and I'm no longer seeing consults, so it's somebody else's issue.
It's harder to deploy on a broader scale. When you're trying to send these out to primary care clinics, you need to have something that's organized, and you need to be able to have a training program. And so we had job aids to train, and we had a whole system in place, but it was just unsustainable in the long term.
I mean, the other way around it is, if you really want to get very practical, is what we did is we would buy I don't know if I'm going to say this exactly correct, an iPod Touch that was a dedicated, smartphone, I guess, and that would just be distributed around. But
Doesn't have the Haku.
yeah.
Can I add something? I have purchased accessories which have only 4 millimeter diameter can be introduced in the ear canal, and it attaches to the power point of the smartphone, and the images is very much clear. And we can have the small procedure like removal of the wax and other procedure. It is available only $24.
Right.
It is made by China and Hong Kong.
Oh. Interesting.
Just a remark here. I think we should distinguish between the otoscopes and the endoscopes, because the otoscopes would be good for primary care physicians, but I would not necessarily give them an endoscope, because that can cause more harm to the ear canal and then cause them not to do the procedure that often. However, in my hospital, the use of the endo-eye, that system that was mentioned, has kind of revolutionized the ENT consults, because now we can go to the ICU, make a laryngotomy, new patient's bed instead of rolling that's what you mentioned. However, I think that the focus for primary care physicians should focus more on the otoscope, not the endoscope. That is too dangerous.
Yes, agreed.
It's a good point. It kind of goes back to what Ellie was talking about, is the taking a long, rigid scope and putting it in the hands of someone who doesn't necessarily know.
The other thing we also haven't really spoke about, but I think it's important to mention too, that as smartphones get larger, it's actually really awkward a little bit, holding, especially with an endoscope. You're like trying to somehow balance this, and so it is a very different skill set than endoscopic ear surgery, where you're looking at across the room, or even an otoscope, where you're looking directly at the patient. There's this other way that you sort of have to adapt to it too, and that also has a learning curve as well. I think when some of these things, might become more wireless, that's, an option as well to sort of minimize it, and you have a separate screen, but that's sort of a ways off.
Yeah, I do have one other comment about that, which is that we were having nursing staff actually take the photos, or they actually take the videos. The video is better because then you can screen capture the best images. But I mean, just imagine training, not even the primary care doctors who are just as overworked as we are, but to train LPNs or even an MA to take a photo. They just walk out the room and say, go take a photo of the left ear. So that, to me, is going to be the sweet spot of where we get something like this to work.
I'll just make a comment on the privacy thing that you said earlier, with this being non-patient identifiable photographs. It's not true. We've lovingly adopted your legal system in the UK. We had a patient who had a very specific ear operation uploaded to YouTube, and the patient recognised that it was them, and then they instituted a legal claim. So yes, it's non-patient identifiable, but you still have to have patient consent.
Yeah.
Good point.
So thank you, America.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. Have a good day.